Okay. You can go.
Yeah. All right. So today we're very happy to have our own MinE committee member, Sulin Sadushau, presenting on a topic that's both relevant in terms of our overall society, but also for economics itself. Within economics, we had, I think, several kind of social media kind of explosions on important topics such as gender, but also Black Lives Matter. And Sulin studies how these phenomena kind of propagate through society. Sulin, the floor is yours.
Lovely. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to present joint work with my wonderful co-authors, Annalie Casanueva-Ates, Vladimir Vitian, and Kritika Saxena. So as you've already hinted at, Vincent, we're looking at the effect of social media on the diffusion of protest. And we're looking at the case of Black Lives Matter in the spring of 2020 as sort of a case study. So how we motivate the research is that social movements and protests only become successful and can really impact true policy change and shape institutions if they extend beyond their initial networks. And the mode of protest diffusion, which we define as sort of the spreading of political action outside of the core of activists to new segments of society, really depends on the means of communication that are available to activists, and of course the size and composition of these networks. And traditionally, mobilization was carried out via face-to-face interactions. So at the time of the civil rights movement, it would be the sit-ins at segregated places where, you know, whites really had to be confronted with sort of the desegregation movement. And today it's mainly based on social media. So activism has moved to the virtual space. There's a nascent literature on how social media can affect protest and protest participation. And the few studies that look at this basically think of social media as a way to reduce coordination costs for individuals that are already sympathetic to a cause. What we're looking at is whether social media can actually help mobilize people outside of these core activist groups and essentially generate new allies. So we're kind of like stumbling upon an ideal quasi-experimental setting, which is essentially the Black Lives Matter movement during the pandemic. And why do we look at that? Well, we have two reasons that, you know, qualify this context as sort of this unique experimental setting. And one of them is that social media experienced record growth in the number of new users and time spent online in the first half of 2020. So maybe you can go back to 3 years ago when the pandemic hit and you started spending more time on Twitter. That was probably healthy. And essentially that is also what Twitter shareholders in Q1 of 2020 were very excited about. So in their shareholder letter, they say that the average monetizable daily active users grew by 24% over year to year. And they say it's driven by typical seasonal strength, but also due to the COVID-19 pandemic. A second reason for why the BLM movement during the pandemic is particularly useful to study this question is that BLM is really a social media phenomenon. Yeah, so it was sort of founded on Twitter and sort of substantially expanded in the second half of 2020. So if you look at sort of the number of hashtags that were used on Black Lives Matter, these hit record levels in the second half, or in the first half of 2020. So the hashtag BLM was used 8.8 million times per day on Twitter. So if you were on Twitter, in 2020, in May and June of 2020, there was essentially no way for you to escape the Black Lives Matter hashtag, whether you were in or outside of sort of the liberal Twitter bubble. Another thing that we see for the Black Lives Matter movement is if we look at the spread of protests across counties in the US, we see that more than half of the counties that started protesting for Black Lives Matter during the pandemic have never done so before. So in the black shaded areas, you see the counties that protest for BLM before and after. And BLM has been founded in 2014, so it has experienced a lot of surges and protest triggers, such as the murder of Trayvon Martin, that could have mobilized these other counties. But we see that these green counties, which are spread all over the US, are actually protesting for the first time in summer of 2020. Another descriptive or stylized fact about these protests is not just they're expanding to new geographies, but they're also expanding to new demographic groups. So again, in green, we're highlighting those places that protested only after the murder of George Floyd. And we plot that over the share of the Black population in the county. And as you can see, that the counties that start protesting in response to the murder of George Floyd are much wider than the counties that would typically protest. So what we do essentially in this paper is we're trying to use COVID as a sort of exogenous shock. So we're trying to instrument COVID and use that as a shock to the social media use. And we generate exogenous variation in baseline Twitter penetration. And combined, we essentially get Twitter penetration during the pandemic, which then leads to protest diffusion to new counties. So just to give a preview of what we find, so we see that pandemic exposure increases the use of social media and increases the likelihood of observing a BLM protest. We instrument COVID with early super spreader events, and I'll talk about this in more detail later. And we focus on counties that have never had a BLM protest before. And what we find is that a 1 standard deviation increase in pandemic exposure increases the number of new Twitter accounts by 27%. And that's very similar to, the number that Twitter itself records. A 1 standard deviation increase in pandemic exposure also increases the protest probability by 9 percentage points. And what we also find is that it's white, affluent, suburban counties with a low ex-ante probability of protesting that joined the protests in 2020. And we can show that this is driven by those counties that actually take up social media during the pandemic. Yeah. And we also spend a lot of time on the paper trying to rule out competing mechanisms, concerns about whether it's really a scattering or a diffusion of protests, looking at the salience of racial inequality that could have come through exposure to the pandemic, the opportunity costs of protesting, and just an overall agitation that we're trying to test. Okay. So we assemble a large body of data, starting with Twitter. So we look at online protests, which is essentially all tweets that contain Black Lives Matter related hashtags. Then we generate an index of baseline Twitter penetration. So in December of 2019, where we take a random sample of tweets that contain the most common 100 English words. And what we also do is from the user profiles, we can extract the date at which the profile was created and can therefore generate a number that shows us how many Twitter profiles were created during the pandemic. And we use a geolocation algorithm that helps us assign tweets to counties. So in total, we have about 100 million tweets that we base this analysis on. We complement this data with Google data, one of them being key mobility indicators that tell us how much time people spend at home, or whether they're outside doing groceries, engaging in leisure activities, being in transit, or going to their workplace. And we gather information on sort of the Google search history of people that we can assign to locations in the US. We use that both to proxy people that search for the term Twitter, but also people that search for BLM related terms. We use all of these variables and combine them into a social media penetration index that we measure both at baseline, but also during the pandemic. We also gather information on offline BLM protests that come from the crowdsourced data collection platform Eleframe. And there we have the time, the number of participants, and the location of protests from June 2014, since the inception of the movement, to September 2020. We use COVID-19 data from the New York Times, super spreader events from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and we have a bunch of socioeconomic factors at the county level, reaching from unemployment to the community resilience, which is an indicator for how resilient a county is when it comes to health crises. So what we're trying to estimate is the effect of COVID on the use of social media during the pandemic. Yeah. So social media in County C is an indicator that is measured during the pandemic, but before the murder of George Floyd. Yeah, so it's a period from January to May 2020. And we use the first principal component of 4 indicators, which is the number of new Twitter accounts, the log number of new Twitter accounts, Google searches for Twitter, supposing that people look for Twitter first before they install it, and from the Google Mobility Index, the time spent at home, hypothesizing that people that are not out and about are more likely to be on social media. COVID is the cumulative number of COVID-19 deaths between January and May, but we also use cases and other measures for COVID exposure. We have state fixed effects and a series of county level controls, and we cluster standard errors at the state level. So let me talk about how we're trying to proxy or get to exogenous variation in COVID exposure. So essentially what we do is we instrument exposure to COVID-19 at the county level with the sum of all super spreader events in the neighboring counties until 6 weeks prior to George Floyd's murder. And let me just take a minute to explain the logic behind this. So what are super spreader events? So there's an epidemiological feature of the pandemic, which means that 70 to 80% of transmissions can be traced back to just a few cases. Yeah, these are highly infectious individuals, which are called super spreader. Yeah, and the database is basically referring to newspaper reports and scientific articles on super spreader events between January 2020 and January 2021. And they're collected and evaluated by researchers from the London School of Hygiene and Medicine. And importantly, these do not have to be mass gatherings or large events. Most of them are essentially recorded in nursing homes, at birthday parties, and in prisons. So this is just a distribution of super spreader events by type. And as you can see, most of the super spreader events are essentially happening in rehabilitation and medical centers and nursing homes. Another feature about super spreader events that we exploit is this idea that there was a small window of opportunity for super spreader events to occur in the first place. Yeah. So you need to have some level of case prevalence of COVID without sort of public awareness of stringency policies that could prohibit the spread of the virus. So as you can see in the blue line, there was a sudden and abrupt spike in the number of super spreader events between mid-March and early April, yeah? Where the new cases, which are marked in red, are increasing, but stringency policies only peak much later. And in response to these stringency policies, you see a simultaneous decrease in these super spreader events. Yeah. So we're really exploiting just that first part in the search of super spreader events, because later waves of super spreader events may be more endogenous to a county's risk preferences, etc. Yeah. Another feature that we exploit is that we don't use super spreader events in the county, but in neighboring counties within a 50-kilometer radius of the county border. So essentially, we count the number of super spreader events that essentially touch the county border, but are not within the border. In the robustness checks, we sort of change the radius. We sort of not just count the super spreader events, but we look at the cases associated with the super spreader events. We have a specification where we also control for super spreader events inside of the county while instrumenting with pandemic exposure with super spreader events outside of the county, and the results hold consistent. Most importantly, let me get back to the IV slide. Most importantly, we have two plausibility checks, which are that super spreader events do not predict baseline Twitter penetration. So if we regress super spreader events on the number of Twitter accounts in December of 2019, we don't see a significant correlation. Same for past BLM protest. Yeah. So we're fairly confident that we can generate exogenous variation in COVID, and COVID can impact a whole battery of outcomes. We focus on the social media part that is affected by COVID. This is the geographic distribution of super spreader events in our data set, and on the right side, you see the instrument that we use. We have a larger geographic variation because we use proximity to super spreader events and not the super spreader events themselves. Okay, so what do we find?
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question about this?
Sure.
So, sort of how important is it that these sort of super spreader events are kind of exogenous? From the map, it sort of looked like there were more super spreader events in blue states and so on. Maybe that was, or
I think it
maybe it
looks
was
like
superficial,
this.
but
Yeah, I think it looks like this because the counties in coastal states, especially on the West Coast, are larger, so they appear larger. But essentially what we do is we look at the effect of, or how much characteristics of the county can predict super spreader events, and we don't find a systematic correlation between county characteristics and the likelihood of experiencing a super spreader event. What we want to avoid, so why don't we just use exposure to COVID? Well, what we want to avoid is to have sort of counties in there that are, you know, particularly interested in organizing large-scale events, or that are very social people. Yeah, social people may be more likely to spread COVID, maybe more likely to be on social media, and maybe more likely to protest for BLM. So this is the kind of unobserved heterogeneity that we don't want in this setting. So what we do is we do a whole bunch of things to show that these early super spreader events are really exogenous to these characteristics, at least based on observables. And most importantly, they're unrelated to the use of social media and the likelihood of protesting before. Yeah. And thereby exploiting these super spreader events, we can sort of find an exogenous variation in COVID exposure, which then helps us get at the use of social media, essentially. And this is also what we find in our data. So we see that COVID is positively related to our social media index, which is the first principal components of these other 4 variables. And we see that it is also positively impacting all of the subcomponents. Yeah. So if we look at this variable, essentially a 1 standard deviation increase in pandemic exposure, as I said before, increases the number of Twitter accounts by 27%. Overall, we see that, 23 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, which is a 1 standard deviation increase, pushes the county from the 40th to the 60th percentile of social media use. So these are actually very, very large effects. What we also do is we look at the effect of COVID on BLM protest. Yeah. So we take as an outcome just a simple dummy variable that tells us whether a county has protested for Black Lives Matter cause after the murder of George Floyd. Yeah. And we see that a 1 standard deviation increase in exposure to the pandemic increases the protest probability by 9 percentage points. We also see that the number of BLM protests increases without really significantly impacting the scope. And we see that online protests also increase. So the number of tweets that include BLM hashtags increases, and the followers of the official BLM account increases. We do a bunch of robustness checks to make sure that our results are, robust to changes in measurement, controlling for spatial correlations and other types of clusterings. We even have 3 alternative identification strategy, 1 exploiting the panel dimension, 1 looking at an alternative instrument, and 1 exploiting a lasso matching approach, and they all point in the same direction. So we see that the pandemic exposure increases the use of social media and increases online and offline BLM protests. And we also show in the paper that this is primarily happening in white, affluent, suburban counties that had an ex-ante low probability of protesting. How do we trace a low ex-ante probability of protesting? Well, we do a lasso selection approach using information on the counties that protested before. And that gives us a continuous measure for each county about the overall likelihood of it protesting. So that takes into account, for instance, the racial composition, the income, voting patterns, etc. And it sort of helps us generate a continuous measure of ex-ante protest probability, although these counties have never actually protested for a BLM-related cause. So how we rationalize these findings is that we think of COVID as a demand shock to social media. This is happening at the intensive and at the extensive margin. So the time spent online, if you already have an account, but also the number of new users that come onto the platform. And what we also know from the literature on the state dependence in technology adoption is that returns to joining social media are particularly high when the existing network is already large enough. Yeah. So you have this sort of inverse U-shaped relationship where you either have everybody who's already on the network, so there's not much margin for the COVID shock to actually push you online, but you also need a certain amount of people who are already on the network in order for you to have a return to joining it. Yeah, because you gain from having people, your friends, your family, your social network be actually on the online platform. So we look at this by interacting COVID with different measures of Twitter penetration. And the idea is you have the demand shock that comes from exogenous variation to COVID, and you have this idea of state dependence and technology adoption, where you have Twitter networks that actually pull people. So it's essentially sort of a push-pull interaction that helps us identify the effect of social media specifically on the likelihood of observing protest. So what we first do is we just include COVID and the number of Twitter accounts that were created during the pandemic, and we see that COVID and pandemic Twitter predict the likelihood of protesting. Now, when we interact COVID and Twitter during the pandemic, we see that the effect of COVID disappears entirely and runs through the increase in the use of Twitter accounts. As we showed before, what we don't want to do is sort of essentially use pandemic Twitter in this setting necessarily, because we know it's co-determined by COVID itself. So what we do is we use baseline Twitter penetration in December of 2019, for which we've shown that COVID is not related to that. But from the literature and state dependence in technology adoption, we know that people are pushed online if there's a strong pull factor in the form of an existing network. So that's what we do. Again, we see that COVID and Twitter at baseline predict BLM protest. And once we interact COVID and baseline Twitter penetration, again, the effect entirely runs through those counties that actually experience an increase in pandemic-related pickup. Another thing that we do is we use an instrumental variable approach proposed by Miller and Schwartz that uses an event that was associated with like a heavy promotion of Twitter in 2007, which is called South by Southwest. And Twitter was a sponsor there, and basically the instrument relies on these early adopters. So what we essentially do in columns 5 and 6 is we generate exogenous variation in baseline Twitter penetration, and we generate exogenous variation in COVID. And again, we find similar results. And all of these coefficients are very similar in magnitude and point to the fact that COVID increases the protest behavior of counties that are unlikely to protest before through the increase in use of social media. What we show so far is county level evidence, and now we're gonna move to individual level evidence. These are just sort of correlations, but we try and control for as much information that we have for the respondents. And we have an indicator for the COVID deaths in the county of the respondents per category. So this is low, medium, and high, and a whole bunch of control variables. And what we see in the survey is that people that are exposed to COVID receive more news about George Floyd. They receive more news about George Floyd on social media, and the relation or the relative information input that comes from social media is larger for those more exposed to COVID-19. We also see that higher exposure to COVID-19 is associated with more positive attitudes towards the Black Lives Matter movement. So they're saying that they're more likely to protest because of structural racism and not because it justifies criminal behavior. And to make sure we're not just sort of picking up progressive respondents, we include a placebo question on the rights of minorities, and particularly undocumented migrants. And we don't see that exposure to COVID-19 affects sort of generalized liberal views in the form of more rights for undocumented migrants. Okay, so in this paper, we find evidence that social media was an important driver in the diffusion of BLM protests to new segments of society during the pandemic. Yeah. And this may also explain why this diffusion mechanism wasn't only contained to the United States. Yeah. So I live in Berlin. I've seen so many people going onto the streets for Black Lives Matter, which isn't necessarily because the police brutality in Germany is of the same form or targets the same people as in the United States. It's essentially sort of a diffusion mechanism that can happen through social media. Another thing that we think that we can contribute is a lot of the papers that use that try to get at exogenous variation in social media use have to really go back to, early stages of the rollout of the internet or social media. So many of these papers have to rely on exogenous variation in the early stages of the pandemic or the early stages of the rollout. So that would be 2000 to 2007. Afterwards, it's very hard in very saturated markets to really get at some exogenous variation. And I think we are sort of providing insight into a mechanism or a setting where we can really see the take-up of social media in a context where almost everybody's already online who wanted to be online. So you really need a big push like the pandemic to move people online. And I think, we're testament to this fact by having sort of this online presentation that is really happening and potentially also sustained. Yeah. Whether this mobilization is lasting and can really lead to institutional change, this is sort of on a different page. And another thing that, we leave open here is whether it is symmetric along the ideological spectrum. So you could think potentially the storm on the Capitol on January 6th may or may not have been possible through this push to social media. Yeah. So this is what we find so far. And I want to thank everyone for letting me present our work. And yeah, happy to respond to questions by email or in any other way.
Right, thank you very much, Sulin, for a fascinating presentation. Can I ask maybe one more question? So following up on that kind of last point, so what do you think is sort of the perception of, say, policymakers in response to these protests? So I guess policymakers just to some extent also observe that sort of the cost of protest has gone down with Twitter. So there's a question of whether they will still take it as seriously, and especially during the pandemic when the cost was, I guess, especially low for people. So do you have any sense of to what extent sort of these social media might also sort of dilute the effectiveness of protests?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, actually. So there are different kinds of theories that try to explain sort of why movements or protests arise and when they're particularly effective. There's theories that think about, Passarelli and Tabellini think about this as sort of an emotional response to injustice. So citizens have sort of are endogenously determined how much they can take, essentially, and if that is sort of surpassed, then they can turn to protest to sort of signal to policymakers that they're overstepping. And this is a tool that can be used outside of election cycles to help policymakers course correct. There are other theories that think of the effectiveness of protest as a form of sort of aggregating information, and in doing so, having policymakers be aware of different types of policy bundles that voters demand, which are probably not already in the political arena. So all of these theories assume that policymakers take this as a sort of information, as a signal of their voters, right? Now, what you're saying is that the signal might be diluted because now that the costs are smaller, the actual desire to signal something doesn't have to be as big in order for me to go protest, right? So if it's very costly for me to protest, then I only go on the street for something that I really, really want to change. And now that it's so easy to protest, maybe it's less likely that you know, this is really something that I'm passionate about. That could be true. I mean, it also depends on sort of the interaction of like movements and counter movements, right? So a lot of these BLM protests were also accompanied by anti-BLM protests and other types of hashtags that we look at. So for instance, we also collect hashtags on Blue Lives Matter. We actually don't see that those increase, but you could imagine that there's sort of always this back and forth, and then policymakers are not clear about what the actual dominant position is. And then it also depends on whether people at the polling stations really respond to that. So there's one paper by Mazumder who looks at the effect of BLM protests on votes, and he sees a marginal effect on that, on voting. But I'm not aware of any papers that actually look at then the policy responses to that. And I think that is to be seen in how far policymakers actually respond to that or discount that.
I see, thanks. It does look like from your results that maybe these sort of marginal protesters that were pulled in during the pandemic might be closer to sort of the median voter than the ones that were already in before the pandemic.
Yeah, that's right. So unfortunately, we can't say much about individual protesters. What we can do is we can infer from the racial, economic composition of the county what the likely composition of the protests are. This can still be selective, but if you have sort of share of Blacks that is close to sort of 2% in a county, that is clearly sort of a different kind of demographic group or context that goes on the streets. So we really interpret this as sort of social media being a way for people who are not directly affected by the grievances of the movement to be exposed to this new information, and that takes them to the street. Yeah, so in the survey, we see that there's some movement on the type of information people receive and sort of how they think about the BLM protests. So we really think it's sort of like this stark, also this very viral, visceral imagery of George Floyd's murder that we've all been exposed to, that then sort of pushes people at the margin to join the movement. And I think social media is a catalyst for that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Shulen. Unless there's more questions, I guess we can wrap up the session. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.